May the 2nd, 1892, Wall Street, New York City. A lone figure walks down Broadway toward the Western Union building, Jay Gould, the most hated man in America. Newspapers have called him a robber baron, a thief, a destroyer of lives. Railroad workers want him dead. Striking miners want him dead. Investors he ruined want him dead. Someone tried to kill him once, failed. Now at 55 years old, he owns more railroads than any man alive, controls the telegraph systems, holds $77 million, enough to buy entire cities. But he cannot buy respect, cannot buy safety, cannot buy one thing wealth promises: peace. So he built a castle. Not in Manhattan, where enemies surrounded him, not where the public could reach him, but on the Hudson River, 40 miles north. A Gothic fortress called Lyndhurst. Stone walls, iron gates. Towers watching the river. A place where hatred could not follow, where his fortune could not be touched, where history would remember him differently. This is the story of the most hated man in America, and the castle he built to outlast the rage, the mansion that survived when everything else fell, the Gothic palace that stands today as proof that some legacies refuse to die. The walk from his office to Western Union took Jay Gould 10 minutes. He made it every day, rain or shine, winter or summer. He did not ride in carriages like other wealthy men, did not parade his fortune. He walked, alone usually, sometimes with one assistant. The crowds parted when they saw him coming, not from respect, from disgust. Men turned their backs, women pulled children away. Shopkeepers stepped inside their stores. Nobody wanted to be near him. Nobody wanted to acknowledge him. He was a ghost moving through the city he helped build. A man so wealthy he could buy entire blocks, but could not buy a friendly greeting. The newspapers that morning had run their usual attacks. The Tribune called him a wrecker of corporations. The Herald said he destroyed honest businesses. The World published a cartoon showing him as a spider sitting on a web of railroad tracks, catching working men, draining them. These attacks appeared daily, had appeared daily for 20 years. Jay Gould never responded, never defended himself, never explained. He just kept walking, kept working, kept building his empire while America hated him for it. At Western Union, telegrams waited. Reports from railroad lines across the country, financial data, stock prices, problems requiring decisions. Gould read them all, responded to each one personally. His handwriting was small and precise, like everything about him. He was a small man, 5 feet 6 inches tall, barely 130 pounds, dark hair and beard going gray, piercing blue eyes that people said could see through lies. He dressed simply, black suits, white shirts, nothing flashy, nothing to draw attention. He wanted to disappear into crowds, be invisible. Impossible when you are the most hated man in the country. The telegrams that day brought mixed news. One railroad was profitable, another was losing money. A strike was brewing in Missouri. Government regulators were investigating his holdings in Iowa. The usual chaos of running an empire. Gould made his decisions quickly. Sell this, buy that, fire him, hire her, move money here, cut costs there. He saw patterns others missed, understood connections others could not grasp. That talent had made him $77 million. It had also made him enemies beyond counting. By noon, he was done. He walked back to his office, completed more paperwork, answered more telegrams, met briefly with 2 bankers who needed his approval on a loan. They were polite, but cold. Business required them to work with Gould. Morality made them hate it. By 2 o'clock, he was ready to leave. He took the train north, up the Hudson River, away from Manhattan, away from the hatred, toward home, toward Lyndhurst, The castle he had built to escape all of this. The train ride took 90 minutes. Gould sat in a private car, read reports, made notes, looked out the window at the river flowing past. The Hudson was beautiful in early May. Trees blooming, water sparkling, hills rising on both sides. This was why he had chosen this location. Not just to escape the city, but to see beauty. To live somewhere that did not remind him of the industrial ugliness his railroads had created. Somewhere that felt removed from the world of strikes and bankruptcies and hatred. Lyndhurst appeared as the train slowed approaching Tarrytown. Gray stone walls rising above the river. Gothic towers pointing at the sky. Turrets and spires making it look like something from medieval Europe. Gould had not built it. A man named William Paulding had constructed the original house in 1838, but Gould had bought it in 1880, then expanded it, added towers, built a massive greenhouse, created formal gardens, turned it from a large house into a castle, a fortress, a place where he could be safe, where his family could be protected, where hatred could not reach them. He had spent $500,000 on the expansions, money he made in a single afternoon of stock trading, but more important than any business deal, because this was home, the only place in America where Jay Gould felt welcome. The carriage met him at the station, brought him up the hill to Lyndhurst, through iron gates, past manicured lawns, up to the main entrance, the Gothic arches, the heavy wooden doors. He went inside, into silence, into safety. His wife Helen had died 3 years earlier. The house felt empty without her, but it was still sanctuary, still the one place he could exist without the weight of public hatred pressing down on every moment. Gould went to his library. 20,000 books lined the walls. He had read most of them: history, science, literature, biography. He was self-educated, had quit school at 16 to work, taught himself everything through reading, through observation, through careful attention to the world around him. That education had made him wealthy, but it had not made him happy. Nothing had made him happy since Helen died. Work filled the time. The castle provided shelter, but happiness was gone. Perhaps it had never existed. Perhaps men like him were not meant to be happy, just successful, just rich, just hated. Understanding how Jay Gould became the most hated man in America requires going back to the beginning, to 1836, to Delaware County in upstate New York, to a small farm where he was born to a poor family. His father was a farmer and storekeeper. His mother died when Jay was young. The family struggled constantly. Never enough money, never enough food, always on the edge of disaster. Jay learned early that poverty was not noble, not character building, not anything except crushing and permanent unless you fought your way out. He started working at 15, left home at 16, never looked back, never wanted to see that poverty again, never wanted to feel that helplessness. He taught himself surveying. Mathematics came easily to him. He could see patterns in numbers that others could not, could calculate angles and distances in his head while others needed paper. He found work surveying land in New York and Pennsylvania, worked 12-hour days, saved every dollar, invested carefully. By 20, he had saved enough to start his own business. His first venture was a tannery, leather processing. He partnered with a man named Zadoc Pratt, who knew the business. Gould provided some capital and handled the accounting. The business should have made modest profits, should have been a stepping stone to bigger things. Instead, it became the first example of a pattern that would define his entire career. Gould saw that Pratt was too trusting, too honest, too willing to give workers higher wages and better conditions. Gould started secretly manipulating the books, moving money, creating false expenses, paying himself more than the partnership agreement allowed. When Pratt discovered this, he sued. The courts eventually ruled in Pratt's favor, but Gould had already taken most of the profits. He walked away with capital to start new ventures. Pratt was left with a failing business and legal debts. Their partnership ended in betrayal. This was 1856. Jay Gould was 20 years old. He had learned a valuable lesson. Honesty was a weakness. Trust was exploitable. Profit mattered more than relationships. He would apply these lessons for the rest of his life. Gould moved to New York City in 1859. He had about $10,000. Not a fortune, but enough to start trading stocks. Wall Street was different then. Smaller, less regulated. More like a casino than a market. Men made fortunes in days, lost them just as quickly. Gould studied the system carefully, learned how stocks moved, understood that information was power, that knowing something before others knew it meant profit, that manipulating information meant even greater profit. He started small, bought railroad stocks, sold them, made modest gains. Then he discovered something more profitable. He could manipulate the stocks themselves, drive prices up through false rumors, drive them down through calculated panic. Buy low, sell high. The profits came faster. Within 3 years, he had turned $10,000 into over $100,000. He was becoming wealthy. He was also becoming known. Other traders watched him. Some tried to copy his methods. Others tried to avoid his trades. Everyone knew Jay Gould was dangerous, smart, ruthless, someone to fear. His big break came in 1867, the Erie Railroad. It was one of the major rail lines connecting New York to the Great Lakes. 500 miles of track, connecting New York City to Buffalo. One of the 4 major trunk lines that moved goods and people across the state. It was also failing. Badly failing. The company had been mismanaged for decades. Directors stealing. Managers incompetent. Maintenance deferred. The track was dangerous. Accidents happened frequently, but the assets were valuable. 500 miles of right-of-way, stations, equipment, land grants. If someone could take control and reorganize, massive profits were possible. Gould saw this immediately. He had been watching Erie for months, studying its finances, understanding its vulnerabilities. He recognized an opportunity. A company too weak to defend itself, but too valuable to ignore. He just needed partners. Men willing to be as ruthless as he was. Men who understood that business was war and ethics were obstacles. He found them. Daniel Drew, Jim Fisk. Drew was old, in his 60s. A former cattle driver who had made millions through stock manipulation. He understood markets, understood how to create artificial scarcity, how to drive prices up and down through careful trading. He had been involved with Erie for years, already on the board, already stealing, but not efficiently enough. Gould saw how to use him. Fisk was younger, flamboyant, loud, the opposite of Gould in personality, but equally ruthless, equally willing to break rules. He brought energy, brought distraction, brought the ability to draw attention away from what Gould was actually doing. Together, the 3 of them made a perfect criminal partnership. Drew provided inside access, Fisk provided cover. Gould provided the planning, the strategy, the cold calculation that made massive theft possible. They gained control of Erie's board in early 1868, bought enough shares, made enough deals, bribed enough other directors. Within months, they controlled the company. Then the looting began. Systematic, organized, relentless. This was not opportunistic theft. This was industrial-scale fraud. The primary method was simple. They printed new shares of stock. Erie had a fixed number of shares authorized in its charter, perhaps 100,000 shares. That limit protected investors, ensured that owning 10% of shares meant owning 10% of the company. But Gould found a loophole. The charter allowed issuing convertible bonds, bonds that could be exchanged for stock under certain conditions. Gould issued millions of dollars in bonds, then immediately converted them to shares. The conversion flooded the market, created hundreds of thousands of new shares. Existing investors saw their ownership percentages collapse. Someone who owned 10% of 100,000 shares suddenly owned 3% of 400,000 shares. Their investment had not lost value in theory, but in practice it had. The company was the same size, generated the same revenue, but was divided among far more owners. Each share was worth less. Gould and his partners pocketed the money from selling the bonds, pocketed the money from converting them, kept creating new shares and selling them. It was legal theft, technically authorized by the charter, but morally and practically no different from counterfeiting. Investors started noticing in mid-1868 their Erie shares were losing value. The stock price was falling. They investigated, discovered what Gould was doing, filed lawsuits, demanded injunctions, wanted courts to stop the share printing. The legal battles began. Dozens of lawsuits, injunctions granted then appealed, countersuits filed. The courts were chaos. But Gould had anticipated this. He had spent months before taking control of Erie, cultivating relationships with judges, bribing them directly, or bribing politicians who appointed them, or making deals that ensured favorable rulings. When injunctions were issued against him, he appealed to judges he controlled. They overturned the injunctions. When criminal charges were filed, prosecutors he had paid refused to pursue them. The system was designed to stop fraud, but Gould had corrupted the system itself, made it unable to function. The lawsuits continued, but accomplished nothing. The share printing continued. Erie's legitimate value was being destroyed, but Gould was getting rich. That was all that mattered to him. Then Cornelius Vanderbilt entered the battle. Vanderbilt was 74 years old in 1868. He had been building his fortune for 60 years, started with one ferry boat in New York Harbor, built a steamship empire, sold it, bought railroads, now owned the New York Central, one of the largest and most profitable railroads in America. He wanted Erie, wanted to connect his lines, create a transportation monopoly across New York State, control everything from New York City to Chicago. He had the money to buy it, had the experience to manage it, just needed to acquire enough shares to take control. He started buying in February 1868, spent millions, acquired tens of thousands of shares. His plan was straightforward. Keep buying until he owned 51%, then fire Gould and his partners. Clean up the company, run it properly. It should have worked. Vanderbilt had more money than Gould, more power, more connections, but he did not understand what he was fighting, did not realize Gould would simply create new shares faster than Vanderbilt could buy them. The battle intensified. Through spring 1868, Vanderbilt bought shares. Gould printed more. Vanderbilt bought those. Gould printed more. The cycle repeated endlessly. Vanderbilt spent $7 million, a fortune, enough to buy entire companies, but never gained control, because the denominator kept changing. He would buy enough shares to own 40%. Then Gould would create more shares, and Vanderbilt's percentage dropped to 30%. He would buy more, rise to 45%. Gould would print more shares. Percentage dropped to 35%. It was mathematical warfare. Vanderbilt was trying to hit a moving target, a target that moved faster the closer he got. He kept buying, convinced his wealth would eventually overwhelm Gould's scheme, convinced that at some point the courts would stop the share printing, convinced that he could not lose to a nobody like Jay Gould. He was wrong. He was losing, badly, and did not realize it until too late. By March 1868, the situation became extreme. Vanderbilt finally understood what was happening. understood he was being cheated. He sued. Not just civil suits, criminal charges, fraud, theft. He wanted Gould arrested. Wanted the share printing stopped permanently. Wanted everything reversed. A judge sympathetic to Vanderbilt issued injunctions and arrest warrants. Gould learned about the warrants hours before they were to be executed. He had informants everywhere, people he paid to keep him informed. The informants warned him. He needed to leave New York immediately. New York judges could arrest him, but New Jersey judges could not. So Gould and Fisk gathered $6 million in cash and bonds from Erie's offices, loaded them into bags, took a ferry across the Hudson River to New Jersey, checked into a hotel in Jersey City, set up a command center. They controlled Erie from New Jersey, could not be arrested there, could continue manipulating the company. Vanderbilt was furious, but could not reach them, could not force them back to New York, could only watch as they continued destroying Erie from across the river. The standoff lasted weeks, Gould in New Jersey, Vanderbilt in New York, both controlling pieces of Erie, both trying to destroy the other. Finally, they negotiated, not because they wanted to, because they had to. The situation was unsustainable. Gould could not return to New York without being arrested. Vanderbilt was losing millions daily as Erie's stock price collapsed from the chaos. They needed a deal. The negotiations happened in secret. The agreement was simple and cynical. Vanderbilt would drop the criminal charges. Gould would buy back most of the shares Vanderbilt had purchased. At the original prices Vanderbilt paid. This meant Vanderbilt would recover his $7 million, would not lose money, but would gain nothing, would abandon his attempt to control Erie. In exchange, Gould would stop printing new shares, would give up Erie's management at some future date, would pay Vanderbilt $1 million for his trouble. Both sides got something. Vanderbilt avoided losses. Gould kept temporary control. But the real winner was obvious. Gould had fought the richest man in America, the most powerful businessman, and had not lost, had forced a draw, at minimum, arguably had won, because Vanderbilt abandoned his attempts to acquire Erie, abandoned his grand plan for monopoly. Gould stayed in control for another 4 years to loot what remained. The Erie War made Jay Gould famous nationally, not celebrated, famous. Newspapers covered every development. The public followed along, fascinated. It was financial warfare at a scale they had never seen. Millions of dollars moved daily. Giant corporations battling for survival. Rumors of bribes and corruption. It was compelling. But the newspapers portrayed it as good versus evil. Vanderbilt was flawed. Everyone knew he was ruthless, but he was respectable. Old money, established. He had built real businesses, created real value. Gould was different. Gould was new, an upstart. Someone who had appeared from nowhere. Someone who created nothing but destroyed much. The newspapers called him names. Robber Baron was the nicest. Others called him swindler, thief, criminal. The New York Tribune ran a series of editorials demanding his prosecution. The Herald published a cartoon showing Gould as an octopus, tentacles wrapped around Erie, squeezing money out, draining it dry. The public ate it up. They needed villains, needed someone to blame for the corruption they saw everywhere. Gould was perfect, small, strange, foreign-looking, easy to hate. The hatred that would define the rest of his life started here, started with Erie, started with the audacity to fight Vanderbilt and survive. Then came Black Friday, September 24, 1869, the day Jay Gould tried to corner the gold market. It remains one of the most audacious financial schemes in American history. Understanding it requires understanding the monetary system of 1869. The United States had just ended the Civil War 4 years earlier. The economy was still adjusting. Paper currency existed, but was not fully trusted. Gold was the real money, the backing for everything else. When you held a dollar bill, it was theoretically redeemable for gold. The government held gold reserves to back the currency. Private individuals and businesses held gold. Banks held gold. The total supply was limited, finite. If someone could control enough of that supply, they could manipulate the price, drive it up, make enormous profits. But they would need to accumulate gold without anyone noticing, without triggering government intervention, without causing panic. It seemed impossible. Jay Gould thought he could do it. The scheme required several elements. First, he needed capital, lots of capital, to buy gold. He had perhaps $10 million available, not enough to corner the market alone, so he recruited partners. Other wealthy speculators who could contribute millions. Together, they assembled perhaps $20 million in buying power. Second, he needed secrecy. If word got out that Gould was accumulating gold, prices would spike immediately. Other speculators would rush in. The government might intervene preemptively, so he used intermediaries, set up shell companies, placed buy orders through brokers who did not know they were working for him, created a network of fake buyers all controlled by him. Third, and most crucial, he needed to prevent government intervention. The Treasury held $100 million in gold reserves. If they sold even a fraction of that, they would flood the market, break any corner, make the entire scheme collapse. Gould needed to know in advance if the government planned to sell, needed inside information from the highest levels, needed access to President Grant himself. He found his access through Abel Corbin. Corbin was married to President Grant's sister. He was a financier, not particularly successful, but well-connected. He had the president's ear, visited the White House regularly, dined with Grant frequently. Gould cultivated Corbin carefully through spring 1869, met him socially, discussed business. Gradually explained his theory about gold, argued that high gold prices would help farmers, would make their crops more valuable in foreign markets, would stimulate the economy. This was nonsense. High gold prices would hurt far more people than they helped. But Corbin believed it, or pretended to believe it. Gould offered him a partnership, put $4 million in gold in Corbin's name. Corbin would receive all profits from that gold. All he had to do was keep Gould informed about government policy. Tell him if the Treasury planned to sell gold. Give advance warning. Corbin agreed. The inside connection was established. Gould now had eyes inside the White House, could plan his corner knowing the government's intentions. Or so he thought. The buying began in June 1869. Slowly at first, small purchases. A few $100,000 of gold, watching how the market reacted. Prices rose slightly. Gould bought more. Prices rose more. He accelerated. By August, he was buying millions daily. The gold price climbed from $130 per ounce to $140, then $145. Market observers noticed, started speculating about manipulation, but could not identify who was behind it. Gould's network of intermediaries hid his involvement. Other speculators started buying too, thinking the price would keep rising. This helped Gould. Their buying pushed prices higher, made his holdings more valuable. By early September, Gould controlled perhaps $40 million in gold. Prices were at $150 per ounce and climbing. He was making millions on paper. The scheme was working. But the higher prices rose, the more dangerous the situation became. Eventually, the government would notice, would investigate, would act. Gould met with President Grant in September. The meeting was arranged by Corbin. Gould traveled to Grant's summer home, had dinner, discussed the economy. Gould argued his theory about high gold prices helping farmers, urged Grant not to sell Treasury gold, to let prices rise naturally. Grant listened, did not commit, did not agree, but did not disagree. Gould left uncertain about what Grant would do. This was a problem. The entire scheme depended on government inaction. If the Treasury sold gold, everything would collapse instantly. Gould needed certainty, needed to know the government's plans. He pushed Corbin to find out more, to press Grant for a commitment. Corbin tried. But Grant was growing suspicious. He started to understand what was happening, started to see that Gould was manipulating gold markets, that Corbin was involved, that he was being used. The insider access was disappearing just when Gould needed it most. By late September, gold prices had reached $160 per ounce. The market was unstable. Businesses could not operate normally when gold prices swung so wildly. Interest rates were affected. Trade was disrupted. There were calls for government intervention. Treasury Secretary George Boutwell was receiving hundreds of telegrams daily, demanding action, demanding the government sell gold to stabilize prices. Boutwell consulted with President Grant. They agreed intervention was necessary. The manipulation had to be stopped. On September 23rd, Grant ordered the Treasury to prepare to sell gold, to sell enough to break the corner, to sell $15 million worth. The order was secret, known only to a few officials, but one of them leaked it, told a friend who told another friend who eventually told someone in Gould's network. The information reached Gould late on September 23rd. The government was going to sell tomorrow, September 24th, Friday, Black Friday. Gould had perhaps 12 hours warning. Others in the gold corner had no warning at all. His partners, the speculators who had bought alongside him. They thought the corner was still working, thought prices would keep rising. Gould knew differently, knew that by tomorrow afternoon their fortunes would be destroyed. He made a decision. A cold, calculated, ruthless decision. He would sell. Secretly, immediately. Dump his gold holdings overnight. Let his partners burn. Betray everyone who had trusted him. Save himself. He placed sell orders through midnight, sold millions in gold, locked in his profits. By morning, September 24th, he had sold most of his position. His partners still held theirs, still thought the corner was working, still expected to get rich. They were hours away from catastrophe. Gould said nothing, warned no one, just waited for the government to act. The Treasury began selling gold at noon on Friday, September 24th. $15 million poured into the market. The effect was immediate and total. Gold prices collapsed, dropped from $160 per ounce to $130 in minutes, kept falling. 120, 110. Fortunes evaporated. Men who had been millionaires on paper at noon were bankrupt by 1 p.m. The gold exchange descended into chaos, traders screaming, throwing papers, some weeping, some raging. The market crashed so hard they had to close trading early, stop the bleeding, but it was too late. Dozens of investors were ruined. Businesses that had been operating on credit backed by gold holdings collapsed. Banks that had loaned money for gold speculation faced default. The crisis spread beyond the gold market, affected stocks, bonds, commodities, everything. By evening, New York's financial district was paralyzed. Businesses closed. Banks suspended operations. The crisis would take months to resolve, would cause a recession, would destroy thousands of innocent people who had no connection to gold speculation, just regular people whose businesses failed when credit dried up, when banks stopped lending, when the entire financial system seized up from the shock. Jay Gould made $15 million. $15 million in profit from selling before the crash. His partners lost everything. The speculators who had trusted him were ruined. But Gould walked away rich, richer than before. The public response was unprecedented. Newspapers called it financial terrorism. The New York Times ran a front-page editorial titled "The Crime of the Century," called Gould a monster, a predator, someone who should be in prison. The Tribune published Gould's address, encouraged readers to take action. This was essentially calling for vigilante justice, for someone to hurt him. The crowds gathered outside his office grew larger and angrier. Thousands of people screaming for his arrest, demanding he return the money, some calling for his death. Gould needed a security force to leave the building, police escort, armed guards. The threats became specific. Letters arrived detailing plans to kill him, describing how they would do it, where, when. Gould took them seriously, hired more guards, changed his routes, varied his schedule, stopped appearing in predictable places. The fear was real. He had made enemies before. But Black Friday created a different level of hatred. This was not abstract, not business opposition. This was personal. This was visceral. Thousands of people had lost their life savings because of him, lost their businesses, their futures. They wanted revenge. Congress launched investigations, multiple committees, hundreds of hours of testimony, thousands of pages of documents. They established that Gould had manipulated the gold market, that he had used inside information, that he had betrayed his partners, that he had profited from a national crisis he created. All of this was documented, proven, established beyond doubt. But none of it was technically illegal. There were no laws against market manipulation in 1869, no insider trading statutes, no regulations preventing what Gould had done. The system had no rules to stop him, no mechanism to punish him. The congressional investigators were frustrated. They could prove everything, but could not prosecute anything. Gould testified, admitted buying gold, admitted selling before the crash, claimed he had no inside information despite overwhelming evidence he did, claimed his actions were normal business practice. The investigators were outraged, but powerless. Gould left the hearings uncharged, unpunished, $15 million richer. The investigations concluded with recommendations for new laws, new regulations, new restrictions on speculation. Some passed eventually, but too late to touch Gould, too late to recover what he stole, too late to help the thousands he ruined. By the 1870s, Gould controlled several railroads. He used them to make more money through manipulation rather than actual service. The strategy was consistent across all his properties: cut worker wages to minimum, reduce safety spending, defer maintenance, raise freight rates, use the profits to buy more railroads, then repeat. Workers suffered under this system. Wages barely covered food and shelter. Safety equipment was inadequate. Accidents happened frequently. Men died, were maimed, left unable to work. Gould did not care, did not visit his railroads, did not see the human cost. He saw only numbers on pages, profits and losses, returns on investment. The workers were abstractions, units of labor, costs to be minimized. When they complained, he ignored them. When they organized unions, he crushed them. When they struck, he brought in armed guards, shot at strikers, killed some, broke the strikes through violence, then blacklisted the organizers so they could never work again. This was standard practice among railroad barons, but Gould was particularly ruthless, particularly cold. Even other businessmen thought he went too far. In 1872, someone tried to kill him. The details are unclear because Gould never spoke publicly about the incident, but multiple newspaper accounts confirm it happened. A man approached Gould on the street in Manhattan, drew a pistol, fired twice. Both shots missed. Guards tackled the gunman before he could fire again. He was arrested. Claimed to be a railroad worker whose brother had died in an accident caused by deferred maintenance on a Gould line. Claimed he wanted revenge, wanted to make Gould pay for the deaths he had caused. The man was convicted, sent to prison. Gould pressed charges vigorously, wanted maximum punishment, but he never testified, never appeared in court. He was terrified. For all his ruthlessness in business, he was physically afraid. He understood that he had created thousands of enemies, that any one of them might try again, that his wealth could not protect him from a bullet. After the assassination attempt, he changed his routine, stopped walking predictable routes, varied his schedule, hired more guards, started spending less time in Manhattan, started looking for somewhere else to live, somewhere farther from the masses he had wronged, somewhere he could be safe. He found Lyndhurst in 1880. It was owned by the Merritt family. They had lived there for years, but could no longer afford the maintenance costs. They needed to sell. Gould saw the property and understood immediately that it was perfect. The location on the Hudson River, 40 miles from Manhattan, far enough to feel distant from the city, close enough that he could commute for business. The Gothic architecture, imposing, fortress-like, the grounds, 67 acres, enough space to create distance, enough land to build walls, to control who approached. He made an offer, $250,000. The Merritts accepted. By May 1880, Jay Gould owned Lyndhurst. He immediately began transforming it into something more. Not just a house, a castle, a stronghold, a place where America's most hated man could live without fear. The original Lyndhurst had been built in 1838 by William Paulding. Paulding was the former mayor of New York City, a respected figure. He had hired Alexander Jackson Davis, one of America's leading architects, to design a Gothic revival country house. Davis created something unique for America, a mansion that looked like it belonged in England. Gray stone walls, pointed arches, turrets and towers, stained glass windows. It was romantic, picturesque, everything the Hudson River estates were supposed to be. Paulding lived there until his death. Then the Merritt family bought it. They maintained the house but made no major changes. When Gould purchased it, the structure was sound but outdated. The grounds were overgrown. The systems were failing. Gould had money to fix all of that, to expand, to transform, to make it truly his own. He hired architects, engineers, landscapers, gave them virtually unlimited budgets. His only requirement was that the work be done quickly. He wanted to move in, wanted to be away from Manhattan, wanted to be somewhere safe. The work began immediately. Gould added entire wings to the mansion. The project began in summer 1880 and would continue for 3 years. Extended the dining room to accommodate his growing family. 6 children needed space, built new bedrooms. Each child would have their own room, something Gould never had growing up. Added bathrooms, modern plumbing throughout. This was still unusual in 1880. Most houses had outdoor privies. Lyndhurst would have indoor plumbing in every bedroom suite, hot water, flush toilets, all at the latest technology. Gould spared no expense. The architects he hired were the best available. They understood Gothic revival, understood how to extend the existing structure without destroying its character. The additions matched the original architecture perfectly. Same gray stone, same pointed arches, same attention to detail. Nobody looking at Lyndhurst today can tell where Paulding's work ends and Gould's begins. That seamless integration cost extra, required skilled craftsmen, required time and careful work. Gould did not care about cost, did not care about time, cared only about perfection. The greenhouse became his obsession. Not a small structure, not a simple glass room for growing plants. This was a greenhouse complex, multiple buildings covering half an acre. The main greenhouse was 200 feet long, 50 feet wide, 30 feet tall at its peak. Glass panels covered the entire structure, thousands of individual panes, each one custom cut, each one fitted into an iron frame. The frame itself was architectural. decorative ironwork, painted dark green, made the building beautiful even from outside. Inside was temperature controlled. Coal-fired boilers in the basement provided heat. Pipes ran throughout, maintained precise temperatures for different types of plants. Tropical orchids needed 80 degrees, temperate plants needed 60. The greenhouse had different zones, each kept at optimal temperature. This required sophisticated engineering, required constant monitoring, required a staff of gardeners working full-time. Gould hired 6 men just to maintain the greenhouse, paid them well, gave them housing on the property, made sure they understood this was his priority. The greenhouse mattered more than anything else at Lyndhurst, more than the formal gardens, more than the mansion itself. This was where Gould found peace. The orchid collection was extraordinary. Gould spent over $100,000 acquiring plants, rare species from South America, Asia, Africa. He worked with dealers in London and Paris. They sent him catalogs. He would order dozens of plants at once, pay enormous prices. A single rare orchid might cost $500, the equivalent of a year's wages for a skilled worker. Gould bought hundreds of them, had them shipped carefully, packed in special containers, kept humid, kept warm. Many died in transit. This was before modern shipping, before careful climate control during transport. Maybe half the orchids survived the journey from their native habitats to New York. Gould accepted these losses, just ordered more, kept accumulating, kept expanding the collection. By 1885, the Lyndhurst greenhouse held over 3,000 orchid plants, representing 500 different species. It was one of the largest private orchid collections in America. Perhaps in the world. Gould knew each plant, knew its needs, its growth patterns, its blooming schedule. He kept detailed records, notebooks filled with observations, when plants bloomed, how many flowers, what colors. He was systematic about his hobby, the same way he was systematic about business, applied the same careful attention to detail, the same need for control. He spent hours in the greenhouse daily, early morning usually, before starting business work. He would walk among the plants, check each one, look for new growth, new buds, signs of disease, problems with pests. The gardeners maintained the day-to-day care, watering, fertilizing, pest control, but Gould made the important decisions: which plants to propagate, which to purchase, how to arrange them for best display. He had sections organized by region: South American orchids in one area, Asian orchids in another, African species in a third. Each section recreated the conditions of that region as closely as possible: humidity levels, temperature, even the type of bark they grew on. Gould imported special materials, tropical hardwood logs for the epiphytic orchids, special soil mixtures for terrestrial species. Everything was researched. Everything was precise. This was not casual gardening. This was scientific horticulture. Gould read every book on orchids he could find, corresponded with botanists in Europe, stayed current on the latest research, applied that knowledge to his collection, made it thrive. The formal gardens outside required equal attention. The grounds covered 67 acres, but only about 10 acres were formally landscaped. The rest remained somewhat natural: woods, meadows, walking paths. But those 10 acres of formal gardens were spectacular. They were designed in the French style: geometric patterns, straight paths, carefully trimmed hedges forming shapes, parterres, knot gardens. Everything symmetrical, everything controlled, nothing wild, nothing natural, just pure designed landscape. The head gardener supervised a crew of 8 men. They worked year-round: spring planting, summer maintenance, fall cleanup, winter preparation. The gardens had to look perfect always. Gould walked them daily. After his time in the greenhouse, before starting business, he would inspect the work, Note any problems, any hedge that needed trimming, any path that needed weeding, any bed that needed replanting. The head gardener received his orders, made corrections. The gardens reflected Gould's need for control, for order, for things to be exactly as he wanted them. Messy. Imperfect gardens were intolerable. Everything had to be maintained. Everything had to be beautiful. Everything had to reflect his vision. The walking paths wound through the less formal areas, miles of paths total. Some led down to the river, views of the Hudson, boats passing, the Palisades visible across the water. Some paths went through the woods, quiet, shaded, private. Gould would walk these paths when he needed to think, when business problems required solutions, when decisions had to be made. Walking helped him think, cleared his mind, let him see patterns, connections, solutions that were not obvious when sitting at a desk. Many of his most profitable trades came to him during these walks. Many of his most successful manipulations were planned while walking through Lyndhurst's grounds. Alone, thinking, calculating. The isolation he created served business purposes, served personal purposes. Let him work undisturbed. Let him strategize without interruption. Let him be himself without the world watching, judging, hating. The river access was important. Lyndhurst's property included waterfront, a small dock, nothing elaborate, just a place to keep a boat. Gould kept a steam launch, a small boat. Big enough for his family. He would take them out on the Hudson, Sunday afternoon sometimes, when weather allowed. These were the rare moments when he seemed relaxed, when his face lost its constant calculation, when he smiled. The children loved these outings, loved having their father's attention, loved being on the water, away from the castle, away from the weight of being Gould's, just a family on a boat. Helen tried to create more of these moments, tried to draw Jay out, make him engage, but he was always pulled back to work, to telegrams waiting, to decisions that could not wait, even on Sundays, even on the river. His mind was elsewhere, planning, scheming, building. The empire demanded constant attention, demanded everything, left nothing for relaxation, nothing for joy, just constant vigilance, constant work. Inside the mansion, renovations continued for years. The library expansion took 2 years alone. Gould's book collection had outgrown the original library space. He needed more shelving, more room. The architects designed an addition, connected to the original library, more Gothic arches, more dark wood shelving, custom built, floor to ceiling. The shelves held 20,000 books, organized by subject, history in one section, science in another, literature, philosophy, economics, biography, everything categorized, everything alphabetized. Gould could find any book instantly, knew his collection completely, had read most of it, would sit for hours reading. This was his other escape besides the greenhouse. Books let him leave the world, enter other times, other places, other minds. He preferred history, liked reading about past empires, how they rose, how they fell, what their leaders did right, what they did wrong. He saw parallels to his own situation, saw himself as a kind of emperor, building something vast, something that would outlast him, or trying to, knowing he would likely fail, knowing empires always fall eventually, but building anyway, because building was what he did, what he knew, what gave his life meaning. The dining room expansion allowed for proper family meals. The table was custom made, solid mahogany, could seat 20 people but usually held 8. Gould, Helen, their 6 children, sometimes a tutor, rarely guests. Gould did not entertain, did not want outsiders at his table, did not want to engage socially. Meals were family time, the one time everyone was together. Morning breakfast, evening dinner. Helen insisted on these meals, insisted everyone attend. be present, talk, share their days. It was her way of maintaining family bonds, of keeping the children connected, of making sure Jay engaged with his family at least twice daily. He went along, sat at the head of the table, listened more than talked. The children would discuss their lessons, their activities, their plans. Jay would nod, occasionally comment, rarely open up. Helen tried to draw him out, asked about his day, about his work. He would give brief answers, nothing detailed, nothing personal, just facts, then returned to listening. The children learned not to expect more, learned their father was present physically but distant emotionally, learned to take what they could get, his presence at meals, his provision of everything material, his protection. That was his love. He could not give more, did not know how. The family quarters occupied the second floor, 8 bedrooms total, each designed for specific family members. Gould and Helen had separate bedrooms. This was common practice among wealthy couples in the Victorian era, not because of marital problems, because of social convention. Husband and wife each had private space, could maintain their own schedules, could have privacy when needed. Gould's bedroom was Spartan, simple, functional, a bed, large but not ornate, a desk where he could work before sleeping, a chair for reading, a wardrobe for clothes. Nothing decorative, no art on walls, no photographs, no personal items. The room could have belonged to anyone, contained nothing that revealed personality, nothing that showed emotion. It was a place to sleep, nothing more. He spent minimal time there, would work until midnight, sleep 6 hours, wake at 6, return to work. The bedroom was transit space, not living space, not comfort space, just necessity. Helen's room was completely different. She had chosen fabrics, rich velvets, silk curtains, colors, deep blues, warm golds, soft creams. Her room had personality, had warmth. Photographs covered her dresser, the children at various ages, her parents, her siblings, family connections, things that mattered to her. She had books by her bed, novels mostly. She read for pleasure, for escape, for brief moments away from the weight of being Mrs. J. Gould. Her room had a sitting area, comfortable chairs, a small table. She would sit there mornings, drink tea, read correspondence, plan the day. This was her sanctuary. The one space in Lyndhurst that felt truly hers. That reflected who she was, not who she had to be. Not the dutiful wife of America's most hated man, just herself, Helen. A woman who had married young, who had borne 6 children, who had watched her husband become a monster in public perception, who loved him anyway, or tried to, who stayed, who raised their children, who made this strange fortress feel like home, or tried to. The children's bedrooms reflected their personalities. George, the oldest, had the largest room after his parents, born 1864. He was 16 when they moved to Lyndhurst, old enough to understand what his father was, what the family represented. His room was organized, neat, books arranged by height, clothes folded precisely. He was trying to be like his father, trying to develop the discipline, the control, the focus, trying to prove he could inherit the empire, could manage it, could be the next Jay Gould. But he lacked something crucial, lacked the coldness, lacked the ability to hurt people without hesitation, lacked the ruthlessness that made his father successful. George was too kind, too ethical, too human. These were good qualities, but fatal flaws for someone expected to maintain a robber baron empire. He would try for decades, would fail, would lose most of what his father built. Not through incompetence, through decency, through inability to be as terrible as success required. Edwin's room was quieter, more introspective. Born 1866, 2 years younger than George. Books everywhere. Philosophy, poetry, history. Edwin loved ideas, loved learning, did not care about business, did not want to be his father, wanted to be himself. Whatever that meant, he was still figuring it out, still trying to understand who Edwin Gould was, separate from being Jay Gould's son. It would take his entire life. He would never fully succeed, would always be defined by his father, would always carry that weight, would always be introduced as son of Jay Gould before anything else. His own achievements, and there would be some, would always be secondary, always measured against his father's empire, always found wanting, not because he failed, because the standard was impossible. The daughters occupied smaller rooms, but made them beautiful. Helen, the eldest daughter, was born 1868. Her room had flowers, paintings of gardens, photographs of Lyndhurst's grounds. She loved the estate, loved the beauty her father had created. Tried to see only that. Tried not to think about how the money was made, how the beauty was purchased. She would marry well, have children, live comfortably, die quietly. Anna was born 1875, youngest daughter. Her room was more dramatic, darker colors, heavy fabrics. She'd inherited some of her father's intensity, his focus, his unwillingness to accept limits. She would marry twice, divorce scandalously, fight for her rights in an era when women had few. She would preserve Lyndhurst after everyone else wanted to sell it, would use her money, her stubbornness, her refusal to let her father's legacy die. She was most like him, most willing to fight, most capable of the ruthlessness preservation required. The castle would survive because of her. Because she was enough like Jay Gould to win battles others lost. Howard was the baby, born 1871. Youngest of 6 children. His room was always messy, toys everywhere when young, books and papers when older. He was scattered, enthusiastic, curious about everything, never focused, never disciplined. He would become a businessman but never successful, would lose money on various ventures, would write a biography of his father decades later, trying to rehabilitate his reputation, trying to explain him, trying to make the public understand that Jay Gould was more than the monster newspapers portrayed. The biography would fail, would convince nobody, would change no minds. The public wanted Gould to remain a villain, wanted him to stay in the role they had assigned. Howard's attempt to humanize him was rejected. The hatred was too deep, too embedded, too useful for everyone who needed someone to blame for Gilded Age excess. Gould was the perfect villain, could not be redeemed, would not be redeemed. Howard's efforts were wasted, but they were loving. They came from a son who remembered a father differently, who saw the man in the greenhouse, the father at dinner, the man who walked the grounds at dawn, who was not kind but was not only cruel either, who was complex, contradictory, human. That version of Jay Gould was not allowed to exist publicly, had to remain private, had to be suppressed by the villain narrative. The children grew up strange, isolated, protected from a world that hated their father. They had tutors, private education, did not attend regular schools, could not. Other children would have tormented them. Teachers would have been hostile. The Gould name was toxic, so Helen educated them at home, hired the best tutors money could buy, gave them advantages, languages, music, mathematics, science, everything they needed to become cultured adults, everything except normal childhoods. They never played with neighborhood children, never attended birthday parties, never had friends visit. Their friends were each other. Their world was Lyndhurst. 67 acres felt enormous when you were young, felt like freedom. You could explore the woods, play by the river, hide in the greenhouse, create imaginary worlds. But as they grew older, the walls became visible. The limits became clear. They were prisoners in paradise, protected, provided for, but isolated, cut off from normal life, from normal experiences, from the ordinary pleasures of being young. They paid for their father's fortune, paid for his success, paid with their childhoods, with their identities, with their futures. They would spend their lives trying to escape his shadow, trying to be seen as themselves, trying to matter for who they were, not whose children they were. They would all fail. The shadow was too large, too dark, too all-consuming. Jay Gould's children would be defined by him forever. Helen tried to shield them, tried to create normalcy, tried to make Lyndhurst feel like just a home, not a fortress, not a refuge, just a place where a family lived. She created routines, structure, morning lessons, afternoon recreation, evening family time, Sundays at church when in the city, holidays celebrated, birthdays acknowledged. She worked constantly to make their strange life feel normal, to give them what other children had: stability, love, attention. She mostly succeeded. The children adored her, depended on her. Understood she was protecting them. Understood she was sacrificing herself. Being Mrs. Jay Gould cost her socially. She was excluded from society. Other wealthy women would not receive her, would not invite her to their homes, would not acknowledge her in public. She was married to a monster. That made her suspect, tainted, unacceptable. She felt this rejection deeply, was lonely, profoundly lonely, surrounded by children and servants, but isolated from adult companionship, from female friendship, from the social life she had expected when she married. She had thought wealth would bring acceptance, would bring entry into elite circles, would bring respect. Instead, it brought isolation, brought hatred directed at her husband that splashed onto her, onto their children. She had not anticipated this, had not understood what marrying Jay Gould would cost. By the time she understood, it was too late. She was trapped by children, by commitment, by the simple fact that leaving was impossible. Divorced women were socially destroyed in that era. She would have lost everything, including her children. So she stayed, made the best of it, created what happiness she could, died too young, worn out, exhausted from carrying the weight of being his wife. Gould's daily routine at Lyndhurst was rigid. He woke early, 5 in the morning usually, worked in his study until 9. Telegrams arrived constantly. Reports from railroad lines across the country. He read them all, made decisions, sent responses. By 9, he ate breakfast with the family, rarely spoke, just listened to the children talk about their lessons, their activities. Helen tried to draw him into conversation. Sometimes succeeded, more often did not. He was mentally still working, still calculating, still planning the next trade, the next acquisition, the next move. After breakfast, he returned to his study, worked until noon, then walked the grounds for an hour, checked on the greenhouse, inspected the gardens, made sure everything was maintained to his specifications. These walks were the only time he relaxed, the only time his mind quieted. Lunch was simple, usually alone in his study, then more work until evening, dinner with the family at 7, then reading in the library until midnight. Every day, the same routine, the same pattern, the same isolation interrupted by brief moments with family. Helen understood what she had married. She had known Jay Gould before he was rich, before he was hated. They had married in 1863 when he was just beginning his rise. She was 19, he was 27. She came from a respectable family, not wealthy, but established. Her family opposed the marriage, thought Gould was too ambitious, too ruthless, too likely to bring scandal. They were right. But Helen saw something else. saw a man who worked constantly, who wanted desperately to escape poverty, who was willing to do whatever that required. She thought she could balance him, thought she could provide the moral center he lacked, thought love might soften his ruthlessness. She was wrong. Marriage did not change Jay Gould. Nothing changed him. He remained cold, calculating, emotionally distant. He loved his family in his way, provided for them, protected them, built them a castle, but he could not give them warmth. Could not give them the emotional connection they needed. He gave them security. That was all he knew how to give. The children grew up strange, isolated, protected. The oldest was George, born 1864. He would eventually inherit his father's railroad empire, but he lacked his father's ruthlessness, lacked the cold calculation required to maintain such wealth. Edwin came next, quieter than George, more introspective. He would become a businessman, but never achieved his father's success. The daughters were Helen, Anna, and Edith. All three would marry into society. Some marriages worked, some failed. All carried the weight of being Jay Gould's daughters. The youngest was Howard, born 1871. He would eventually write a biography of his father. Defensive, trying to rehabilitate his reputation. It would fail. The public did not want rehabilitation, wanted continued hatred, wanted to remember Gould as villain. The children understood this, understood that they would always be defined by their father, that no achievement would overcome his reputation, that wealth came with a permanent cost. Helen kept the household running, managed the servants, organized the children's education, created routines that gave structure to their isolated lives. She rarely left Lyndhurst, knew she was not welcome in New York society, knew other wealthy families would not receive her. Occasionally, she visited relatives, attended church when in the city, but mostly she stayed home, stayed with her children, stayed in the one place where the Gould name did not bring immediate rejection. She was lonely, profoundly lonely. Surrounded by family but isolated from the world. Her health declined through the 1880s. Nothing specific, just a gradual weakening. She was tired of fighting, of pretending, of trying to make their strange life feel normal. She died in January 1889, just 50 years old. The official cause was heart failure, but really she died from exhaustion, from carrying the weight of being Mrs. Jay Gould for 26 years. Her death devastated Gould. He was 53 years old, had spent his entire adult life focused on business, on wealth, on revenge against a world that had judged him inferior because of his poverty. He had won that revenge, become richer than almost anyone, built an empire, destroyed enemies, achieved everything ambition promised. But when Helen died, he realized that wealth could not fill the emptiness, could not replace human connection, could not buy back time. He tried to keep working, maintained his routine, but the castle felt even colder now, the library less comforting, the gardens less peaceful. He was alone in a way he had never been, surrounded by servants and children and business associates, but truly alone. Some men might have changed, might have softened, sought redemption. Gould did not. He just worked harder, stayed in his study longer, avoided thinking about loss by focusing on numbers, on trades, on the endless calculation of profit and loss. It was all he knew how to do. By 1890, Gould's health was failing. He had tuberculosis, common in that era, deadly. He knew he was dying. Doctors told him to rest, to travel somewhere warm, to stop working. He ignored them, kept his same routine, woke at 5, worked until midnight. The coughing got worse. He lost weight. His face became gaunt, but he continued. Continued because stopping meant admitting defeat, meant acknowledging mortality, meant facing the reality that all his wealth could not save him, that he would die just like poor men died. That death did not respect riches. In his last months, he spent more time in the greenhouse, more time with his orchids. They were dying too. He had not maintained them properly, had not given them the attention they needed. They were wilting, browning, falling apart, like him. He saw the parallel, understood that even with all his control, he could not stop decay, could not prevent ending. May the 2nd, 1892. The day that opened this story. Jay Gould walking to Western Union, making his daily rounds, working despite failing health. He would die 7 months later, December 2nd, 1892, at Lyndhurst, in his bedroom, surrounded by his children. His last words, according to those present, were about business, about a railroad deal that needed completion. No profound statements, no deathbed revelations, no requests for forgiveness, just business. He died at 56 years old, worth $77 million, owner of 10,000 miles of railroad, controller of Western Union Telegraph, the most hated man in America, and he died alone, emotionally alone, with family physically present but spiritually isolated. The man who had spent his life building walls, financial walls, social walls, the walls around Lyndhurst. He died inside those walls, protected from the world, but also separated from it. The question facing his family was immediate and practical. What do we do with Lyndhurst now? The funeral was small, held at Lyndhurst. Only family and a few business associates attended. No public announcement, no newspaper coverage until after the burial. The family feared demonstrations, feared that workers might show up to celebrate his death, that investors he had ruined might cause disruptions. So they kept it quiet, buried him quickly, moved on. The estate passed to his children. George got the majority of the business holdings, the railroads, the telegraph systems, the stock portfolio. He was 28 years old, expected to maintain what his father had built. The problem was immediate. George was not Jay Gould, did not have the ruthlessness, did not have the calculation, did not have the stomach for the cutthroat manipulation that had built the empire. He tried. For years he tried. Kept the businesses running, made decisions, attempted to maintain the wealth. But he was slower, more cautious, more ethical. In business, those qualities meant losing. Within a decade, he had lost most of what his father built, not all at once, gradually, through bad decisions, through missing opportunities, through being outmaneuvered by competitors who were willing to be as ruthless as his father had been. Lyndhurst became a problem immediately. The maintenance costs were crushing, $100,000 annually, property taxes, staff salaries, utilities, repairs. The greenhouse alone required constant expensive care. The gardens needed full-time gardeners. The building systems were aging. Everything needed money, lots of money. George had less coming in than his father had. The businesses were declining, the profits shrinking. Within 5 years, he was considering selling Lyndhurst. The family discussed it. George wanted to sell, take the money, invest it more wisely. But his sisters, especially Anna, objected. This was their home, their father's legacy, the place where their mother was buried. They could not just abandon it. The debate continued through the late 1890s. George grew more desperate. The costs were eating into his declining capital. He needed to sell. But the market for such properties was non-existent. Who would buy a 67-room Gothic castle in Tarrytown? Who could afford the maintenance? Who would want the association with Jay Gould? The mansion was toxic, beautiful but toxic, worth millions in theory, worthless in practice. By 1897, George was openly discussing demolition, tear down the building, sell the land. 67 acres on the Hudson River would bring good money. The location was valuable, even if the structure was not. Developers would buy it, build smaller houses, make a profit. The family could split the proceeds, move on with their lives. Anna fought this plan vigorously. She had married a French nobleman, Count Boni de Castellane. He was a fortune hunter, married Anna for her money, spent it lavishly, by all accounts treated her terribly. But he understood the value of properties, understood that destroying Lyndhurst would be a mistake, that it had historical value, cultural value, that someday it might matter. He convinced Anna to use her inheritance money to subsidize the maintenance, to keep it from being demolished. It was a temporary solution, but it worked. George kept ownership. Anna paid the deficits. Lyndhurst survived. This was the first near death. The first time the castle almost disappeared. It survived because one daughter refused to let her father's legacy be erased. Even though that legacy was hatred. Even though preserving it meant preserving the memory of America's most hated man. The early 1900s were difficult years for Lyndhurst. The family rarely used it. George preferred living in Manhattan. The younger children had married and moved away. The castle sat mostly empty. Caretakers maintained the basics, kept the roof from leaking, stopped vandalism. But the gardens went wild. The greenhouse fell into disrepair. Many of the orchids died. The formal landscaping reverted to wilderness. The building itself aged. Paint faded. Wood rotted. Stone crumbled. Lyndhurst was dying slowly, not from catastrophe, from neglect. From the simple fact that nobody wanted it. Nobody could afford it. Nobody knew what to do with it. This pattern would repeat for decades. The castle would hover between maintenance and abandonment, never quite falling apart, never quite thriving, just existing, waiting. For what? Nobody knew. Anna Gould finally divorced Count Boni de Castellane in 1906. It was scandalous. Divorced women were socially ruined in that era. But Anna did not care. She took her children, kept her remaining money, married again. This time to his cousin, another nobleman. The second marriage was better. He was kinder, less wasteful. They lived primarily in France, but Anna maintained her financial support of Lyndhurst, continued sending money to cover deficits, continued insisting it not be demolished. She understood something her siblings did not. That the castle was more than a building. It was proof that her father had achieved something, that his wealth was real, that the Gould family mattered. Without Lyndhurst, they were just rich people with a criminal past. With it, they had history, had architecture, had something tangible to point to and say, our father built this. It was preservation driven by pride, by refusal to admit that everything her father built was wrong, by need to believe that some part of his legacy deserved to survive. World War I changed America, changed attitudes toward wealth. The Gilded Age had celebrated millionaires, admired their mansions, aspired to their lifestyle. The war made excess seem wrong, wasteful, unpatriotic. The massive country estates started feeling like embarrassments, symbols of inequality rather than achievement. Lyndhurst was particularly vulnerable to this shift. It was not just a mansion. It was the mansion of America's most hated millionaire, a monument to everything the progressive era wanted to erase. Railroad monopolies, stock manipulation, worker exploitation. The castle represented all of it. Some people started arguing it should be destroyed, not for financial reasons, for moral ones. To erase the memory, to refuse to let Jay Gould's name survive. Anna fought these arguments, but they stung. They reinforced that preservation was a battle, not just against economics, against history itself, against a culture that wanted to forget, that wanted to move on, that wanted villains to stay buried. George Gould died in 1923. He was 59 years old. He had spent 30 years trying to maintain his father's empire. Failed at almost every attempt, lost most of the railroads to bankruptcy, sold the telegraph holdings, liquidated the stock portfolio. The fortune that had been $77 million in 1892 was perhaps $5 million by 1923. Still wealthy by any standard, but a catastrophic decline. 90% lost. George's children inherited what remained. They had even less interest in Lyndhurst than George had. They wanted to sell. Finally, permanently, end the bleeding. Anna was still alive, still opposed, still sending money to keep the property maintained. But she was aging, her influence declining, her ability to subsidize weakening. The second near death was approaching. This time it would be close. This time the castle would almost fall. The Great Depression arrived in 1929. Stock markets collapsed. Banks failed. Fortunes dissolved. The remaining Gould wealth took severe hits. What had been $5 million became $1 million, then less. The subsidies Anna had been providing stopped. She could not afford them anymore. Nobody could. The caretakers at Lyndhurst were dismissed. Maintenance stopped completely. The building began to deteriorate rapidly. Roofs leaked, windows broke, animals moved in, vandals discovered it, broke more windows, stole fixtures, damaged walls. By 1935, Lyndhurst was effectively abandoned. The Gould family still owned it legally, but they had not visited in years, had not spent money on it, had written it off as a loss. The question was whether to just let it collapse or to actively demolish it. Either way, the castle was dying. 40 years after Jay Gould's death, his fortress was falling apart. The hatred had outlasted the hater. The legacy was crumbling. The memory was fading. Everything he had built to survive was failing. Then Anna did something unexpected. She donated it. In 1961, shortly before her death, she transferred ownership of Lyndhurst to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The trust was a young organization, founded in 1949, dedicated to saving historic properties. They accepted the donation, but immediately regretted it. Lyndhurst was a disaster. Decades of neglect had caused millions in damage. The roof needed complete replacement. The plaster was falling. The electrical system was dangerous. The plumbing was shot. An engineering report estimated $2 million in necessary repairs. The trust had perhaps $50,000 available. They had accepted a gift that was actually a burden. A beautiful burden. But a burden nonetheless. They considered refusing the donation, legally returning it, but that would mean demolition. The family had made clear they would not maintain it, would tear it down, rather than continue paying. So the trust kept it, started fundraising, begged donors, applied for grants, desperately tried to keep Lyndhurst from collapsing while they figured out how to save it. The 1960s were crisis years. The trust managed minimal repairs, stopped the roof from leaking in most places, boarded up broken windows, kept vandals out mostly. But they could not do the major work needed, could not restore, could only prevent total collapse. Meanwhile, Westchester County was pressuring them. The property was an eyesore, a liability. The county wanted it demolished, wanted the land returned to productive use. The trust resisted, but had no good arguments. They were not maintaining the property, were not opening it to the public, were just letting it sit there deteriorating. The county started threatening legal action, claiming public safety hazards, demanding either full restoration or demolition. The trust had no money for restoration, which left one option. In 1965, they came very close to authorizing demolition. The board met, discussed options, voted. The decision was close, very close. But ultimately, they decided to try one more fundraising push, one more appeal, one more attempt to save it. That decision, barely made, saved Lyndhurst. This was the second near death. the moment when demolition was authorized, when the paperwork was prepared, when the bulldozers were almost called. Anna Gould had preserved it once. The National Trust preserved it by the thinnest margin, but it survived again. The fundraising campaign of 1966 was desperate. The trust sent letters to every wealthy person in New York, to foundations, to corporations, to anyone who might care about historic preservation. The responses were mixed. Many people did not care, did not see why a robber baron's mansion deserved saving, thought it should be demolished as punishment, as erasure. But some understood that architecture has value separate from the person who built it, that Gothic revival was important, that the building itself was art, that history includes villains, that forgetting them does not erase their influence. The donations came slowly, 5,000 here, 10,000 there. By 1967, they had raised $300,000. Not enough for complete restoration, but enough for critical repairs, enough to stabilize, enough to reopen the property to the public, to start generating some revenue through tours. It was survival, not victory, but survival mattered. Lyndhurst opened to the public in 1968. The response was surprising. People were curious, wanted to see inside the mansion of America's most hated man, wanted to walk his halls, see his library, stand in the greenhouse where he found his only peace. The tour guides emphasized architecture, emphasized history, downplayed the criminal aspects, downplayed the strikes and the manipulation and the deaths, made it about art, about preservation, about a significant example of Gothic revival in America. This framing worked. Visitors came, not crowds, but enough. Enough to generate $50,000 annually in revenue, nowhere near enough to cover the $600,000 annual operating costs, but something. A start. Proof that the public would pay to see Lyndhurst if given the chance. The trust continued fundraising, continued seeking grants, continued the constant scramble to keep the property operational. The castle stabilized, not thrived. Stabilized, which was better than dying, which was more than anyone expected. The decades passed, Lyndhurst existed, tours continued, the grounds were maintained better. The building received incremental repairs, new roof sections, updated electrical, safer plumbing. But the major restoration never happened. Never enough money, never enough priority. The trust had dozens of properties, all needed funding, all competed for limited resources. Lyndhurst was important, but not the most important, was significant, but not unique. The trust allocated accordingly, gave enough to keep it standing, not enough to restore it to glory. That pattern continued through the 1970s and 1980s. The castle survived, but barely, always on the edge, always one funding crisis from closure, always vulnerable. The third near death was building. The final crisis was approaching. The question was whether Lyndhurst would survive again, or whether, after a century of fighting, it would finally fall. The crisis came in 1999. The National Trust conducted a comprehensive assessment of all its properties, evaluated financial performance, maintenance needs, cultural significance, return on investment. Lyndhurst scored poorly. Tourist revenue had declined. Maintenance costs had increased. The backlog of needed repairs had grown to $8 million. The property was losing $600,000 annually. The trust board discussed the situation. Some members argued for continued support, historic value, architectural significance, the responsibility of preservation. Others argued for divestment, limited resources, better investments elsewhere, the need to prioritize. The debate was heated. Ultimately, the board decided. Lyndhurst would be given 3 years to become financially self-sufficient, to raise capital for major repairs, to prove it deserved continued trust ownership. If it failed, the property would be sold to anyone who would buy it, for any use they wanted, including demolition. The countdown began. This was the third near death, the final test. The moment when everything would be decided. The Lyndhurst staff launched an emergency capital campaign, $8 million goal. Ambitious, perhaps impossible, but necessary. They reached out to everyone: preservation organizations, wealthy donors, local businesses, government grants. The pitch was straightforward. This is one of America's finest Gothic Revival estates, one of the few remaining Gilded Age properties still intact. If we lose it, we lose an irreplaceable piece of architectural history. Some people responded. Preservation groups contributed. Local donors helped. But progress was slow. By 2001, they had raised $2 million, 25% of the goal. Not enough, not fast enough. Time was running out. The staff tried different approaches, hosted fundraising events at Lyndhurst, evening galas, garden parties. Used the property itself as the pitch. Come see what you are saving. Experience the beauty. Understand why it matters. These events helped, generated interest, brought new donors. But still the goal seemed distant. $8 million is a lot of money, especially for a property associated with a villain, especially in a culture that did not value Gilded Age excess. The staff was fighting history, fighting economics, fighting public indifference. It felt impossible. Then something unexpected happened. A small number of major donors emerged, people who believed in preservation regardless of the person who built the property. People who understood that art transcends the artist, that architecture outlasts the architect, that history includes everything, not just what we admire. These donors contributed large amounts, 500,000, $1 million. Together, they provided the breakthrough. By mid-2002, the campaign had raised $6 million, 3/4 of the goal. Close enough that the trust agreed to continue support. Close enough that Lyndhurst had survived. Again. The third time. The final time. The crisis that should have killed it, but did not. The property was saved. The major repairs were funded. The restoration could begin. Jay Gould's castle had outlasted the hatred, had outlasted the economic arguments, had outlasted 3 separate attempts to erase it. It survived because enough people believed buildings matter, because architecture has value, because Gothic Revival is beautiful regardless of who commissioned it, because history is messy and includes villains, and we preserve it anyway. Lyndhurst stands today, open to the public, maintained, secure. The castle that should not exist, but does. Walking through Lyndhurst today, you can see what Jay Gould saw. The Gothic arches rising 30 feet overhead. The stone walls 3 feet thick in places. The towers with their pointed peaks reaching toward the sky. The library with its books, many from Gould's original collection. 20,000 volumes. First editions. Rare books, historical texts he studied obsessively. The greenhouse has been rebuilt and maintained, not as large as Gould's original. Budget constraints forced compromises, but still beautiful, still functional, still growing orchids. Some descended from plants Gould cultivated, living connections to his obsession. The gardens are not as elaborate as Gould made them, cannot be. The staff is smaller, the budget tighter, but they are still beautiful, still show the formal French style he preferred, still maintain the straight paths, the geometric patterns, the controlled perfection. The Hudson River is visible through the trees. Boats pass on the water just as they did in Gould's time. The view has not changed. The world around Lyndhurst has transformed completely, but from the castle grounds, looking at the river, you could almost believe it is still 1890, still the Gilded Age, still the era when men like Gould could build castles. The castle feels peaceful now, quiet, removed from the world. Exactly what Gould wanted when he bought it. But everything else has changed. The hatred is gone. The guards who once patrolled the property are gone. The walls that were built to keep enemies out now exist to welcome visitors in. The iron gates that were closed and locked are open during visiting hours. Anyone can enter. Anyone can walk the grounds. Anyone can tour the mansion. The fortress has become a museum. The private refuge has become public property, not through conquest, not through government seizure, through donation, through Anna Gould's decision in 1961 to give it to the National Trust, to make it available to everyone, to let the public see what their father built with money extracted from them. The irony is almost too perfect. The man who stole from the public created a building that became public property. The wealth he accumulated through fraud became a cultural asset for everyone. 50,000 people visit annually. They come from everywhere. New York City mostly. Day trippers looking for history, looking for beauty, looking for a taste of Gilded Age luxury. They walk through rooms Gould walked through, see furniture he owned, stand in the library where he read, look out windows at views he saw. The tour groups move through the mansion in careful paths. Docents lead them, explain the architecture, describe the rooms, tell stories. The tour takes 90 minutes, covers the main floor, the library, the dining room, the drawing room, the conservatory, the main hall with its grand staircase. Visitors are not allowed upstairs. The family bedrooms are off limits. Too fragile, too personal. They remain as they were, preserved, frozen. Museum staff can access them for research, for maintenance. But the public sees only the public rooms, sees only what Gould wanted outsiders to see, not the private spaces, not where he actually lived. Most visitors know nothing about Jay Gould before arriving, know nothing about the Erie War, nothing about Black Friday, nothing about the strikes and the manipulation and the theft. They just heard about a beautiful castle, a Gothic revival masterpiece, a piece of architectural history. They come expecting beauty. They find it. The docents tell Gould's story carefully, very carefully. Acknowledge his reputation, mention he was a railroad baron, mention he was controversial, use words like aggressive businessman and complicated figure. Avoid words like criminal or thief or monster. The tours focus on architecture, focus on the building itself, the Gothic revival style, the innovative greenhouse design, the formal gardens, the art collection, the furniture, the decorative arts. All the things that can be appreciated without moral judgment, all the things that exist independent of how the money was made. The docents talk about Alexander Jackson Davis, the original architect, talk about the Paulding family who built the first version, talk about the Merritt family who owned it before Gould, then talk about Gould's additions, his expansions, his improvements. Focus on what he built, not what he destroyed. Focus on the beauty he created, not the lives he ruined. Focus on what survived, not what was lost. This framing works. Visitors enjoy the tours, leave satisfied, post positive reviews. The building is beautiful. The history is interesting. The location is spectacular. Nobody leaves thinking about the workers who died building Gould's railroads. Nobody leaves thinking about the investors he defrauded. Nobody leaves angry about Black Friday. They leave thinking about Gothic architecture, about Gilded Age excess, about how wealthy people lived. The moral questions are abstracted, made historical, made distant, made someone else's problem. The tours succeed by making Jay Gould disappear, by making the castle more important than the man, by making the art transcend the artist. This is intentional, necessary. If visitors had to confront the full reality of who Gould was, what he did, how he made his money, many would refuse to enter, would refuse to admire anything he built, would demand the castle be torn down as penance, as justice, as refusal to celebrate villainy. The tours avoid this by avoiding him. Gould becomes background, context. The thing that explains how the castle exists, but not the reason to visit. The castle itself becomes the story. Becomes worth preserving regardless of provenance. Becomes art that transcends biography. The gift shop sells books about Gilded Age architecture, about Gothic revival, about Hudson River estates. Some books mention Gould, most do not. Visitors buy postcards showing the castle's exterior, showing the grounds, showing the greenhouse. They buy decorative items inspired by the architecture. They do not buy books about robber barons. Do not buy histories of labor strikes. Do not buy accounts of financial fraud. Those books exist, are written, are available elsewhere, but not at Lyndhurst. Here the story is carefully controlled, carefully edited, carefully managed to make the experience pleasant, educational but not disturbing, historical but not challenging. The National Trust needs donations, needs members, needs public support. Making people angry about Jay Gould would undermine all of that. Better to make them admire the castle. Better to focus on preservation. Better to emphasize beauty. Better to avoid the uncomfortable questions about whether beautiful things built by terrible means deserve to survive. Those questions matter, though. They are the real story of Lyndhurst, not the architecture, not the Gothic revival details, not the greenhouse or the gardens or the river views. The real story is whether we can separate art from artist, whether buildings can transcend their builders, whether preservation is separate from moral judgment. Lyndhurst forces these questions every time someone visits, every time the National Trust fundraises for it, every time a docent gives a tour. Can we admire something created by evil? Can we preserve something built with stolen money? Can we celebrate beauty that cost lives? There are no easy answers, just choices. The choice to save or destroy, to remember or forget, to preserve or erase. The National Trust chose preservation, chose to save the building despite the man, chose to make it public despite its private origin, chose beauty over justice, chose architecture over ethics. Whether that was the right choice depends on what you value, depends on what you think history is for, depends on whether you believe objects outlast their moral context, depends on your answer to an impossible question. What do we do with beautiful things made by monsters? The irony is thick. Jay Gould built Lyndhurst to escape hatred, to have one place where his reputation did not define everything, where he could exist without judgment. He never achieved that in life, but achieved it in death, not through redemption, not through forgiveness, through time, through simple persistence, through the building outlasting the memory. Most visitors today do not hate Jay Gould, do not feel strongly about him at all. He is just a name, just a historical figure, just the man who built this castle. The hatred that defined his life has evaporated. The enemies who wanted him dead are all dead themselves. The investors he ruined are forgotten. The workers he exploited are lost to history. Only the building remains, only the architecture, only the Gothic walls and the iron gates and the stone towers pointing at the sky. Gould wanted to be remembered differently, wanted to be respected, wanted to be admired. He never achieved that. But he achieved something else. He achieved persistence. The castle stands. That is enough. The question the castle raises is uncomfortable. Can beautiful things be built by ugly means? Can art transcend the artist? Can architecture outlast the architect's sins? Lyndhurst forces those questions, forces visitors to reconcile beauty with villainy, to appreciate while not approving, to preserve while not forgiving. It is not redemption. Preservation is not absolution. The tours do not erase the strikes. The Gothic arches do not undo the frauds. The maintained gardens do not bring back the workers who died. But the building stands anyway. Stands because enough people believed that history matters. All of history. Not just the parts we admire, the comfortable parts, the inspiring parts, but also the difficult parts, the uncomfortable parts, the parts that show us what wealth can build and what it can destroy. Lyndhurst is both, a monument to achievement and to exploitation, to beauty and to ruthlessness, to what one man could create and what he could not. Jay Gould died believing his castle would protect his legacy, would ensure he was remembered. He was half right. He is remembered, but not how he hoped. Not as a builder, not as a businessman, not as someone who rose from poverty through talent and determination. He is remembered as a villain, as a robber baron, as the most hated man in America. The castle did not change that, could not change that, but it did survive. Through 3 near deaths, through a century of opposition, through decades when nobody wanted it, when maintaining it made no economic sense, when every logical argument said, demolish it. It survived because buildings are stubborn, because architecture persists, because once something is built, destroying it requires active effort. And sometimes that effort is too much. Sometimes people cannot quite bring themselves to tear down something beautiful, even if they hate who built it, even if preserving it means preserving a memory they wish would disappear. They preserve it anyway, because hatred is temporary. Architecture is permanent. Time forgets everything. Stone remembers nothing. The castle stands. Visiting Lyndhurst on a quiet autumn afternoon, you can understand why it survived. The way light filters through the Gothic windows, the way the tower shadows fall across the lawns, the way the river glitters between the trees. It is beautiful. Undeniably beautiful. That beauty is why it stands. Not justice. Not forgiveness. Not redemption. Just beauty. Pure aesthetic value overcoming historical reality. Overcoming moral judgments, overcoming the weight of a terrible reputation. The building won by being too beautiful to destroy, by creating spaces too lovely to bulldoze, by existing as proof that architecture transcends biography, that buildings outlast builders, that stone outlasts scandal, that Gothic towers outlast robber barons. Jay Gould has been dead for over a century. His fortune is scattered. His empire is dissolved. His name is mostly forgotten, but his castle stands, open to the public, maintained, protected, surviving. The fortress that was supposed to keep the world out now invites the world in. The walls that were built to defend now welcome. The gates that were closed now open. The castle that should have died 3 times now seems permanent. The Gothic palace on the Hudson, the monument to America's most hated man, the building that survived the hatred, the legacy that refused to die. Lyndhurst stands. That is the story. That is all the story. The castle stands.